Ethan Blake had everything most people only dreamed of: wealth, power, and the kind of success that earned magazine covers and boardroom envy. That evening he stepped out of a downtown restaurant after a long business dinner, loosening his tie as the chill of the night air swept through the city. He was tired, his mind spinning with numbers, deals, and expansion plans. His driver had parked around the corner, and as Ethan walked toward the car, something caught his eye near the dimly lit edge of the park dot. At first it was just another shape in the shadows, a figure lying on a bench, wrapped in a blanket so thin it barely counted as protection against the night. Normally he would have kept walking. He'd seen dozens of homeless people every day in this city, but something about the shape, the way the person was cold, fragile and still, made him pause. And then he saw the shoes, black flats, the kind worn by house staff. The blanket shifted slightly in the wind, and the woman's face came into view, illuminated faintly by a nearby street lamp. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught. It was Maria, the woman who had been serving him breakfast for nearly 2 years. Maria, who always greeted him with a soft smile and warm tea in the mornings. Maria, who never asked for anything, never complained, never showed signs of struggle. And now, she was sleeping outside in the cold, on a public bench, still wearing her uniform. Ethan felt a strange wave rush over him: guilt, disbelief, confusion. How could he not have known? She had been in his home that very morning, polishing silverware and folding linens, as if her world wasn't silently falling apart. He took a step closer, careful not to wake her. She looked so small, her thin hands clasped beneath her cheek like a child's. The contrast was overwhelming. He had just dined on a $300 steak, while this woman, who served him every day, was wrapped in desperation. He backed away slowly, heart pounding. The city noises around him seemed to vanish. That image of Maria on the bench burned itself into his mind like a scar. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his home earlier than usual. He walked into the kitchen where Maria was already working, humming softly, as if the night before had never happened. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her posture was composed, dignified even. She turned and smiled when she saw him. "Good morning, sir," she said gently. Ethan struggled to find the words. "Maria, may I speak with you? Please sit." She looked surprised. He had never asked her to sit before, but she obeyed quietly, folding her hands on her lap. "I saw you last night, at the park." Her eyes widened, then fell. Silence filled the kitchen. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered. "I lost my apartment 2 months ago. My son, he got sick back home. I've been sending all my pay to cover his treatments. I couldn't afford rent anymore. I didn't want to lose my job too." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly looked away. "I didn't want pity. I just wanted to keep working. I knew if I said anything, maybe I'd be seen differently." Ethan was stunned, not by the hardship, though it broke his heart, but by the strength in her voice, the quiet pride she held even now. He nodded. "Slowly, you won't lose your job," he said firmly. "But starting today, you won't be sleeping outside either." Maria looked up, confused. Ethan stood, his decision made, not just with his wallet, but with his heart. The following week, Maria moved into a cozy apartment paid in full by Ethan, but he didn't stop there. He set up a fund to bring her son over for treatment, and offered Maria a new role managing a foundation he'd just launched, one that provided emergency housing and jobs for women in crisis. What he saw that night changed him. He had walked past hundreds of homeless faces before, but that night it wasn't a stranger. It was someone who'd handed him a cup of tea with kindness and dignity. Someone who reminded him that behind every quiet smile, there might be a storm hidden from view. And from that storm, with compassion, something extraordinary could rise. The sunlight poured into Ethan's pristine kitchen, bouncing off marble counters and gleaming stainless steel. Everything was silent, except for the faint ticking of the vintage wall clock and the soft clink of silverware being placed back in its drawer. Maria was there, as always, moving quietly, efficiently, respectfully. But now, after the shocking discovery of her sleeping on a park bench just hours earlier, Ethan saw her through different eyes. He sat at the kitchen island, watching her, with a hollow ache in his chest. For the first time, he allowed himself to replay the memories he had brushed aside. Moments that once seemed trivial, now screamed for attention. He remembered how Maria had started staying later than usual, often volunteering to clean long after the rest of the staff had gone home. He had assumed she was simply dedicated, loyal, maybe just liked the quiet of an empty house. But now he wondered, was she staying late because she had nowhere to go? He remembered asking her once, half distracted, "Don't you want to get home early tonight?" Asterisk, she had smiled politely and said, I don't mind staying, sir. It's peaceful here. Asterisk, peaceful here. Those words struck him now with a painful clarity. Asterisk, there were other signs too. Times he'd see her skip lunch breaks, quietly making tea for others while not eating herself. When he asked if she'd had anything to eat, she'd always brush it off with a soft, I'll eat later, sir. He never pressed her. Asterisk, and then there was the way she avoided eye contact when anyone brought up family. Do you have kids? Another maid had asked once during a holiday gathering. Maria had smiled tightly, nodding, but gave no details. She excused herself soon after. Asterisk, Ethan realized now that she had built a wall so carefully, so respectfully, that no one dared to look behind it, and he, in his comfort and busyness, hadn't thought to ask. He had assumed that if she were truly in need, she would say something, but she hadn't. She worked in a mansion, Ethan whispered aloud to himself, his voice bitter with shame, but had no home of her own, and she never said a word. Asterisk, the words echoed in the empty space around him. Asterisk, he stared at the untouched breakfast on the counter, a perfectly plated meal prepared by the same woman who had spent the night exposed to the elements, risking her safety just to hold on to her job. It felt surreal, cruel, and it was all happening right under his nose. Asterisk, Ethan stood slowly, watching Maria as she quietly folded a dish towel. She still looked tired, though she was trying hard to hide it. Still standing straight, still moving, with grace. Asterisk, he walked out of the kitchen without saying a word, but this time, not because he was unaware. Asterisk, this time, he walked out with a storm building in his chest, one of guilt, of awakening, and of purpose. What he had overlooked could no longer be unseen. What she had suffered in silence would never be ignored again. Asterisk, the sun had barely risen when Ethan stepped into his grand, echoing home, its silence broken only by the soft humming he recognized instantly. Maria. She was already in the kitchen, arranging breakfast trays with her usual care. Her posture was calm, composed, almost rehearsed, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching her with an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. How could she be here so early, after spending the night, exposed to cold pavement and passing strangers? How could she be pouring orange juice with steady hands when her own life had quietly fallen apart? He cleared his throat. Maria turned quickly, startled. Good morning, sir, she said, managing a smile that faltered at the corners. Asterisk, Maria, Ethan said softly, can we sit for a moment, please? Asterisk, her smile faded, replaced by confusion. She hesitated but nodded and followed him to the sitting area near the fireplace. For a long second, neither spoke. The ticking of the nearby clock filled the silence, like a metronome counting the beats of everything unsaid. Asterisk, I saw you last night, Ethan finally said. At the park. Maria stiffened, her eyes dropping instantly to her lap. I didn't want anyone to know, she said after a pause, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not your problem, sir. I'm sorry. Asterisk, no, don't apologize, Ethan said, leaning forward, his tone gentler than she'd ever heard from him. Just tell me why, please. Asterisk, her hands trembled as she clutched them together. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then quietly she said, my son is sick. Back home he needs treatment, something with his lungs. I send every cent I can to help him, but a few months ago I couldn't keep up. Rent got behind. The landlord changed the locks. Ethan's heart dropped. I stayed in a shelter for a while, but then I couldn't always get a spot, so sometimes I'd sleep outside. I didn't want to lose this job, Mr. Blakett, the only good thing I had left. I thought, if I just worked harder, maybe no one would notice. Asterisk, tears slipped down her cheeks, but she wiped them quickly, as if afraid they might cost her everything. Asterisk, Ethan was silent, stunned by the depth of her quiet suffering. This woman, who had never once missed a shift, who had offered nothing but grace and discipline, had been fighting a storm alone, in a world full of noise and wealth. Her pain had gone unheard. Asterisk, I didn't want anyone to think I was weak, Maria added quietly. I didn't want pity. Asterisk, Ethan looked at her, truly looked, not as an employee, not as part of the staff, but as a mother, a woman, a human being who had sacrificed everything for the people she loved. And suddenly, he felt smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. Asterisk, he reached out, placing a steady hand over hers. Asterisk, you are not weak, he said firmly. You're one of the strongest people I've ever known. Asterisk, Maria looked up, startled by the sincerity in his voice. Asterisk, you will not sleep on the streets again, not while I have a roof over my head. Not while I can do something about it. Tears returned to her eyes, but this time she didn't wipe them away. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Then don't, Ethan said. Let me say it for both of us. In that moment, something shifted not just in Maria's life, but in Ethan's soul. A crack opened where his indifference once lived, replaced now with something deeper: understanding, responsibility, and an overwhelming need to make things right. The summer sun bathed Ethan Blake's backyard in golden light. The garden had been transformed into something out of a dream: white tablecloths, soft string lights, fresh flowers lining the fence. Staff members mingled in confusion, sipping lemonade, unsure why they had been invited to such an elegant midweek gathering. At the center of it all stood Ethan, calmer and more present than he'd been in years. He watched the staff chatting and laughing, but his eyes kept drifting to one person: Maria. She stood quietly near the back, her posture modest, her eyes wary. She hadn't been told why she was there, only that Mr. Blake had invited her personally. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her blouse, and she looked around as if afraid to believe she belonged. Ethan stepped forward and gently tapped his glass. The crowd fell silent. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice steady. Today isn't about a company milestone or another business success. It's about someone who has quietly shaped this home, someone who has given more than most people ever see. He turned toward Maria. A few weeks ago, I learned something that broke my heart. I discovered that Maria, someone who has cared for this house with dignity, someone who always gave without asking, had no place to sleep at night. Homeless, but still, she came here every day with a smile. She worked with love, without ever asking for anything in return. Gasps rippled through the staff. Maria froze, her cheeks flushed, eyes beginning to water. Ethan continued. She gave everything for her son, for her family. She endured what no one should ever have to, especially not alone. He stepped closer and held out a small object, wrapped in ribbon, a set of house keys. Maria looked at them, stunned. These, he said, are yours. Your own place, safe, warm, yours. Her lips trembled, and she brought a hand to her mouth to hold in a sob. But Ethan wasn't done. And this, he said, turning to the crowd, is something else I've been working on. Today, I'm launching a foundation, the Maria Initiative, a support network for working women in crisis, women who are often invisible, carrying burdens no one sees. He turned back to her, and I can think of no one more qualified, more deserving, more compassionate to lead it than you. Maria stood frozen, tears now streaming freely, and then, from behind the curtain of a small gazebo, a young boy stepped forward, her son, her knees nearly buckled. Mama, he called out, his voice cracking. She rushed forward, enveloping him in her arms, shaking from the shock and joy. The staff around them stood silent, many now wiping tears from their own eyes. Ethan waited a moment, letting the beauty of the reunion breathe, before he added softly, no one who gives so much should ever sleep on the street again. And in that moment, under the open sky, something extraordinary happened. A woman who had been invisible to the world stood at the center of a tan shone. The community center wasn't grand. Its walls were plain, its furniture secondhand, and the paint still smelled faintly new. But inside, something powerful was growing: a haven, a home, a second chance. And at the heart of it all stood Maria. She moved through the modest space with quiet authority, her once faded uniform replaced by a warm cardigan and a name badge that read, Director, the Maria Initiative. Her steps were confident, her smile open, and her eyes, those tired eyes that once hid so much pain, now sparkled with hope. She walked to the front door just as it opened, revealing a young woman holding a toddler on her hip, her face pale and worn with sleepless nights and too many unanswered prayers. Welcome, Maria said softly, holding the door wide. Come in. You're safe here. The woman blinked, overwhelmed, then stepped inside. Maria knelt and handed the child a small toy from the welcome basket. We'll help you get settled, she added, placing a comforting hand on the woman's shoulder. You're not alone anymore. From the far corner of the room, Ethan watched in silence. He didn't come often, preferring to let Maria lead, but today he couldn't stay away. It had been 6 months since that evening in his backyard, the day everything changed. What had started as one act of compassion had now grown into something far greater than he ever imagined. Volunteers worked at desks behind Maria, helping women fill out forms for housing, childcare, and job training. Laughter and conversation filled the once empty rooms. In the corner, children played while their mothers met with counselors. The walls were now lined with photos, smiling faces, before and after stories, and messages of thanks from women who had once stood exactly where that young mother stood today. Asterisk. Ethan felt something stir inside him, a blend of awe and humility. Asterisk. He remembered the night he found Maria curled on a park bench, invisible to a world too busy to care. He remembered her shaking voice as she explained her silence, her pride, her pain. And now, here she was, turning her own suffering into strength for others. Asterisk. Maria glanced up and saw him standing there. She smiled, not the quiet, uncertain smile she used to wear, but one filled with deep purpose and peace. Ethan smiled back, his chest tight with emotion. Asterisk. All it took was one act of compassion, he thought, watching as Maria led the woman and her child down the hallway. And now, hundreds were sleeping under safe roofs. Asterisk. And in that quiet moment, Ethan understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Asterisk. Sometimes changing the world doesn't start with a grand gesture. Sometimes it begins when one person finally sees another and chooses to care. Asterisk.